Ah, so you want to walk the dusty paths of history too, my child? Well, come sit by me, get close to the fire, and listen carefully. I'm about to tell you the stories of great kings, powerful lords, and land-bound serfs. I'll lift the curtain on an era where fate was written in iron and blood. It was a time when mighty empires fell apart and chaos ruled the land. A time when swords took the place of justice and the lands were divided between the powerful. With the fall of the Carolingian Empire, Europe was thrown into turmoil. There was no order, no law, only a system where the strongest survived. And in the middle of this disorder, a new structure began to rise, a system built on land, power, and loyalty. Peasants living under the protection of a lord, knights swearing loyalty, and barons creating their own little kingdoms. We call this feudalism. But this system is no simple game. Like a sword with two edges, one side brings security while the other brings oppression. Now, listen closely, my child. Let me tell you how this feudal system came to be. I'll show you how the strongest rose to power, how the weakest were crushed, and how this era shaped the world you now know. If you're ready, our journey begins now. Ah, my child, history is filled with forgotten heroes and empires that have faded into the past. And today, I'm going to tell you the story of the fall of a giant, how the mighty Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's great legacy, was torn apart, and how, from those ruins, a new order was born. It's the early 9th century. There's an empire rising over Europe, the Carolingians, and the most powerful of them all, Charlemagne, this great ruler who sat on the Frankish throne, ruled with an iron fist and brought back the dream of the Roman Empire. He controlled vast lands, what's now France, Germany, Italy, and even parts of Spain. He forged a strong alliance with the Church and was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Ah, what glorious days they were. But you know, my child, no empire lasts forever. Charlemagne, on his deathbed, seemed to leave behind a strong state. But an empire should be ruled with both sword and wisdom, and unfortunately the ones who inherited his legacy lacked that wisdom. His son Louis the Pious, what a poor ruler he was. He wasn't as mighty as Charlemagne, couldn't command armies, nor could he play the political games with skill. His deep devotion to the church often shook his throne, and his biggest mistake, dividing the empire among his 3 sons. That decision was the first major blow that would drag the Carolingian dynasty into the dark pages of history. By 841, Louis's sons were at each other's throats. After their father's death, they started fighting. Brother against brother, blood was spilled, and lands were plundered. In the end, in 843, the Treaty of Verdun was signed, and the great Carolingian Empire was split into 3 parts. Lothar took Italy, and the western parts of what is now the Netherlands and Germany. The West Frankish Kingdom laid the foundations for modern France, while the East Frankish Kingdom would eventually become Germany. This division wasn't just a change on a map, my child. It was a fragmentation that would change the fate of Europe. A once mighty empire was now nothing more than a collection of warring little kingdoms. Power had slipped from the central authority and was now in the hands of local lords, dukes, and counts. And at that very point, the first seeds of the feudal system were planted. Kings were now only kings in name. The real power lay in the hands of the lords who ruled over their own small worlds. Each one acted like a king in their own lands, feeding their own armies and creating their own laws. And the people? They either swore loyalty to a lord's protection or were left without a master at the mercy of raiders. Weakness and chaos had given birth to a new system, feudalism, a world where the strong ruled and the weak sought shelter. Now, close your eyes, my child. Imagine for a moment Charlemagne's glorious days. Then suddenly, everything falls apart. The lands are divided, wars break out everywhere. In those dark days, Europe was slowly pushed into the embrace of the feudal system. But the story doesn't end there. Now, I'll tell you about the storm that followed that great collapse. How the Vikings, Magyars, and Arab raids ravaged Europe and forced the people into the protection of powerful lords. Are you ready, my child? Then listen carefully, because the real story is just beginning. Kid, what I'm about to tell you covers the darkest years of the Dark Ages. This is the time when the weak were crushed, the strong rose up, and all of Europe was trembling in fear. The empire Charlemagne left behind was already falling apart. Great cities had turned to ruins, and roads weren't safe anymore. And as if that wasn't enough, raiders from all directions were bringing fire and blood to the continent. Have you ever heard of the men who came with the freezing winds from the north, sweeping the shores with their long ships? They were as ruthless as thunder, as merciless as the sea, and as fast as the wind. We call them the Vikings, wolves of the sea from the north. And in the 10th century, these warriors descended on Europe like a nightmare, with axes and swords in their hands, hunger and greed in their eyes. Their goal was simple: to loot, burn, and plunder churches filled with gold. Their first raids hit the coasts of France and England. The Vikings came quickly from the seas, attacking monasteries, killing priests, and setting holy places on fire. When Lindisfarne was attacked in 793, people believed it was God's punishment. But that was just the beginning. The Viking raiders, moving up the Seine River, reached the gates of Paris in 845. They laid siege to the city, spreading terror, and French King Charles the Bald could only convince them to leave by paying a huge ransom. But kid, the Vikings weren't just simple raiders. Wherever they went, they left a lasting impact. They settled in Normandy and created a duchy. In England, they founded kingdoms and established a system where they ruled according to their own laws. And these invasions terrified the people. They needed a strong leader to protect them. That's when the great lords and knights began to rise. The people had to swear loyalty to the power that could protect them. And that, my friend, was one of the major foundations of the feudal system. But the Vikings were just the harbingers of disaster, kid, because from the east, from the endless steppes, came another threat, the Magyars. These people, born on horseback and raised on the battlefield, pushed deep into Europe. From the late 9th century, Hungarian cavalry began raiding Germany, Italy, and France. They were warriors who moved like lightning. They were so fast that their arrows would hit their targets before their enemies could even draw their swords. The Hungarian cavalry continued to spread fear across Europe until 955, when Holy Roman Emperor Otto defeated them in the Battle of Lechfeld. This battle ended the Hungarian raids and pushed them back beyond the Danube River. But during these raids, villages and towns across Europe were devastated. People started gathering around the great lords for protection and began building castles to defend their villages. But there was also a threat coming from the south, kid. Arab pirates from the African coasts and the Iberian Peninsula. They spread fear not just at sea but on land too. Much of Spain was in Muslim hands, and raiders coming from there were burning and destroying the Mediterranean coastline. Great trading cities like Marseille were attacked. Southern Italy and Sicily were raided time and again. Churches and monasteries, full of gold and sacred relics, made perfect targets. That's why the Christian world had to strengthen its defenses. The papacy began giving more power to local lords, and huge walls were built. So, during these years when the Vikings attacked from the north, the Magyars from the east, and the Arabs from the south, Europe lost its former strength. Great kings were now distant, powerless, and helpless. The people had forgotten about central authority. The only ones who could protect them were the lords who ruled over their lands. That's why people accepted the feudal system. Living under a small lord's protection was safer than being left to fend for yourself. Working under a knight's sword was better than being at the mercy of raiders. And that's how the lords and counts grew stronger. Feudalism became not just a system of government, but a necessity. Kid, do you get it now? This isn't just the history of wars, it's the story of survival. The weak sought shelter under the wings of the strong. Justice was written at the tip of a sword. And Europe, shaking off the central authority of the old empires, opened the door to an age ruled by lords and barons. But the story doesn't end here. Now, I'm going to tell you how the feudal system took shape, how the lords gained power, and how the people adapted to this new order. Because feudalism wasn't just a system of governance, it became a way of life. Are you ready? Then keep listening. Son, think about this for a second. Is a piece of land just dirt, or does it determine the fate of those who rule it? Land is power. Land ensures a person's survival. And the biggest truth of the feudal age was this: if you didn't have land, you didn't have anything. But back then, land wasn't just ordinary property. Every piece was a symbol of loyalty and service. This was the foundation of the feudal system. Lords gave land to their vassals, and in return, the vassals offered their blood and loyalty. Now, let me take you into this world. Close your eyes and imagine the stone walls of an old castle. Hear a knight swear his oath. Because loyalty and blood flowed through the veins of the feudal system, picture a king, son. He's built a great empire, commanding armies, expanding his castles. But one day, Vikings invade from the north, Hungarians from the east, Arab pirates from the south. The king can't be everywhere at once. So what does he do? That's where the feudal system comes in. A king needs an army to rule, but mercenaries aren't trustworthy and the people are worried about their own safety. So the king calls on his most loyal men. He gives them land, but it's not a gift, it's a contract. In this system, the king grants large estates to his most loyal men, his dukes, earls, and barons. But there's a cost. Those lords must gather their armies and go to war whenever the king calls. The land they receive is called a fief. And this system wasn't just for the top levels, it extended to all of society. A lord would divide his vast lands into smaller parts and give them to his vassals. These vassals were knights and smaller landholders. In exchange, they were required to serve their lords with loyalty. And so, from the top to the bottom, a hierarchy was created. Lords and vassals, masters and servants. But remember, son, this service wasn't just a verbal promise of loyalty. It was a contract sealed in blood. Imagine a knight, son, armed with his sword, his armor gleaming on the battlefield. But he needs a place to live, too. So he enters the service of a lord. The lord gives him a fief, a small plot of land, a few peasants, maybe a mill, and the knight swears loyalty to this lord. This oath is no mere wordplay. A knight kneels, holds his lord's hand, and says, "My sword will rise for you and will never fall unless for you. My blood and my life are yours." So this land becomes the knight's responsibility. But take note, the property still belongs to the lord. The knight can only manage the land with his lord's permission. If the knight betrays his lord, if his loyalty falters, the land will be taken from him, his honor will be stripped, and at worst, his life will end. This system was so solid that for centuries, it became the backbone of Europe. A king couldn't directly manage all the land, and a peasant couldn't survive alone. Everyone was tied to someone else. Land wasn't just property, it was a bond, a chain. And that chain surrounded the entire continent. Now let me explain the layers of the feudal system, son. Remember, at the top there was always a king. But the king wasn't an absolute ruler. His power depended on the loyalty of his lords. The king was seen as God's representative on earth. But how strong a king was depended on how well he controlled his lords. A weak king could face betrayal from disloyal lords. Below the king were the most powerful men, the dukes and earls. They ruled large regions. A duke was like a small king in his own land. He raised his own army, built his own castles. Under the dukes and earls there were smaller lords, the barons. Barons gave land to their own vassals. Their service came from knights. Knights fought for their lords, defended castles, and followed orders. And at the bottom there were the peasants. Farmers, craftsmen, workers. Many were serfs, meaning they weren't free. They were bound to a lord's land and had to live there for life. But in return, their lord offered protection. This system kept Europe standing for centuries. Everyone was bound to someone else. Everyone had a master. And even though the system was harsh, it created order. But son, there's one more thing you need to know. The feudal system didn't just shape the present, it shaped the future too. When a lord died, his land went to his son. When a knight grew old and couldn't fight anymore, his son would take his place. Inheritance was the strongest rule of the feudal system. Power passed from father to son, and loyalty was passed to the next generation. And so for years, this system continued without breaking. Lords, kings, and knights swore loyalty to each other, and the people lived their lives as part of this system. But son, no system lasts forever. One day the feudal system would be shaken, but until then, swords would define loyalty, and land would show who would live and who would die. Now, you know how the feudal society worked, but this is just the beginning, son, because a system only works when rules are in place. So, how did these lords and vassals keep order among themselves? In the next part of the story, I'll explain how feudal justice worked and how lords held power over the people. Kid, I've told you about lords, knights, and kings, the powerful ones, the ones living in castles. But now, I'm going to tell you the real story, the real life. Because most people living in the feudal age weren't lords or knights. They were the ones tied to the land, serfs and peasants. Where do you think a lord's, a king's, or a knight's power comes from? Their sword, their army? No, kid. Power comes from the land, from the crops, the animals, the worked soil. And the ones keeping this world standing were those who worked the land. But do you think they had any freedom? Well, that's a whole different story. In the feudal system, everyone had their place, kid. The king sat at the top and the lords and knights served him. But below them, the peasants carried the real weight of the feudal system. And there was a division among the peasants, too. The free ones and the unfree ones. The free peasants owned small plots of land. They grew their crops, harvested them, worked the land, but still lived under the protection of a lord. When war broke out, they had to join their lord's army, but at least they could determine their own lives. But the serfs, the serfs, their life was something else. A serf wasn't a slave, but they weren't free either. They were tied to the land they worked, belonging to a lord. The lord owned the land, and the serf was like a shadow working that land. When a lord bought new land, the serfs came along with it. If a lord told a serf to go, they had nowhere to go. If he said stay, they'd live there forever. Being a serf wasn't like being chained in iron, kid. Wherever a serf went, they carried invisible chains. Those chains weren't from laws, they came from the fight to survive. Now, close your eyes and imagine waking up as a serf. The sun has just risen, but your work never really stopped. Your hands are calloused, your back is weighed down by years of labor. You're hungry because there's hardly anything left from the crops you gave to your lord, but you have to go to the fields before you can even eat. Life for the serfs was all about work. Fields had to be planted, wood gathered from the forests, sheep herded, the mill had to run. Farmers plowed, women spun wool, baked bread, and even kids worked. But none of this was for their own good. It was for the Lord's benefit. A serf spent at least 3 days of the week working on their Lord's land. They had some time left to work their own small plot, but the best land was always the Lord's prime property. Serfs were stuck working the worst land. And it wasn't just farming. If the Lord was building a castle, the serfs carried the stones. If the lord declared war, serfs provided food for his army, and some were even forced to fight. The women worked at the lord's manor, sometimes even at the castle. At the heart of the feudal system, it was the serfs who bore the real burden. And kid, being a serf wasn't just about working, it was about giving most of what you earned to someone else. Because in the feudal system, the lords weren't just landowners, they were also tax collectors. Serfs had to give a large portion of what they produced to their lords. A serf would give nearly half of their wheat to their lord, then pay the church's tithe. If they wanted to grind grain, they had to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. Want to get married? You needed the lord's permission. Want to buy a pair of oxen? You were still dependent on your lord's approval. Serfs were under the shadow of their lord every step of the way. But do you know what the worst part was? If war broke out and the lord was captured, the serfs would pay the ransom. Even if they couldn't feed themselves, they still had to pay their lord's debt. And if someone was born a serf, they died a serf, their son would be a serf, their grandson too, because a serf's fate was sealed the moment they were born. Maybe you're wondering, kid, if life was so hard for the serfs, why didn't they rebel? Why didn't they rise up against their lord? Ah, kid, because for the serfs, the world was only the village they lived in. Most serfs hadn't traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Their world was as big as their lord allowed it to be. They couldn't read or write. They didn't know the games of kings and lords. All they knew was working the land. And most importantly, they had no alternatives. If they left their lord, where would they go? Die of hunger in the woods? Go into another lord's land and get killed as a stranger? So the system continued. For centuries, serfs worked the land, lords fought wars, kings protected their thrones. And the feudal system kept ticking like a clock, built on blood and sweat. Life was tough for the serfs, kid, but nothing lasts forever. Over time, the world began to change. Cities grew, trade developed, and slowly the peasants started to become free. But I'll tell you about that later. For now, you know this. The real burden of the feudal age was carried by the serfs. While lords sat on their thrones, serfs worked in the fields, sweating and bleeding, and this went on for a long time. Kid, back in the feudal age, everyone was tied to the land. Some worked the land while others protected it with their swords. That's why the feudal system wasn't just made up of lords and peasants, it was also a society of warriors. These were the men, shining like steel on horseback, knights. But being a knight wasn't just about putting on armor and swinging a sword. Knighthood was an identity, a way of life. It was one of the cornerstones of feudal warfare. And on the battlefield, it wasn't just about courage, it was about discipline too. Knights weren't your average folks, kid. To become a knight, you had to be born noble. No matter how brave a peasant was, a lord wouldn't dress him in armor. Knighthood was a title passed down from father to son, and only the children of nobles were worthy of it. But being born noble wasn't enough. Becoming a knight was a long and hard journey. A child before turning 7 would be sent off to a lord's castle. There he'd first become a page, learning to tend to horses, serve the knights, and serve food at his lord's table. He'd also start training in hunting, horseback riding, and basic combat. By the time he was 14, he would become a squire. At this point, he could go to war, help a knight put on his armor, and sometimes even fight in his place. He'd learn to manage his own sword, spear, and horse. But the most important thing he'd learned was loyalty. Because a knight wasn't just a strong fighter, he was a servant of his lord. Then, when he turned 18, or 20, if he had proven his bravery, he'd be made a knight in a ceremony. The lord would lightly touch his shoulder with a sword and say, "I dedicate you to the service of God and the kingdom. You will be a protector of justice, honor, and mercy." But that oath wasn't just words. Becoming a knight was a destiny written in blood and steel. Kid, war was never just about one person. A warrior's skill mattered, but the real power came from the order of battle. Feudal armies were organized in a strict hierarchy. At the top was the king, Below him were the dukes and counts, and below them were barons, knights, and at the bottom were peasants and mercenaries. But when a lord decided to go to war, he was responsible for gathering his own forces. A baron or a count would call the knights living on his land and gather soldiers made up of their squires and peasants. How big a lord's army would be depended on the size of his land. Land was power. The more land you had, the more soldiers you could gather. On the battlefield, the knights were the real power. These heavily armored men, fighting from horseback, were the strongest warriors of the feudal age. But not every battle was won by knights. Foot soldiers, archers, spearmen, and light cavalry were also essential parts of an army. War wasn't just won with swords and shields. In the feudal age, a lord's greatest power was his castle. Castles were the heart of feudal warfare. A lord needed strong walls to protect his land, and a castle wasn't just made up of stone walls. Inside, there were granaries, weapon stores, wells, and escape routes. When a lord declared war, his first target was usually the enemy's castle. But taking a castle wasn't easy. Sieges could last for years, and hunger and disease could wipe out soldiers. Siege weapons like catapults, battering rams, and siege towers would be used. But even then, a strong castle could withstand hundreds of soldiers. And that's why the soldiers inside the castles, the knights, were true masters of war. Let me explain how feudal warfare worked, kid. Because war wasn't just won by strength, it was won with brains too. Knights were deadly in direct combat. They would charge at the enemy on horseback, using their long lances to break through enemy lines. But the enemy knew this too. That's why foot soldiers would create spear walls and archers would attack from a distance. Before a battle, armies would usually divide into 3 sections: the front line, the center, and the reserve forces. The strongest knights would be placed in the center, with light foot soldiers and archers in the front. If the army was well organized, they could surround and destroy the enemy. But a single mistake on the battlefield could ruin everything. A wrong command from a lord could lead to the death of hundreds of knights. That's why commanders, just like the soldiers, had to be well trained. The wise man fell silent. His eyes, glowing in the firelight, seemed like they were watching a war from the distant past. Then, he took a deep breath, shook his head, and spoke again. Being a knight wasn't just about fighting, kid. Knights were also supposed to be representatives of honor, loyalty, and justice. They had to keep their word, protect the weak, and remain loyal to their lords. But humans don't always keep their word. Over time, knights became corrupted. They stopped being warriors and became self-serving nobles. And one day, the feudal system would bring an end to them too. But that's a story for another time. Now you know how the warriors of the feudal age were born, how they fought, ruled, and eventually faded into the dusty pages of history. Son, there was a time when every stone, every castle, and every field in Europe was controlled by 2 great powers. One was the power of the sword, and the other was the power of faith. While kings declared their rule on the battlefield, the clergy prayed to save their souls. But remember, the church didn't just rule through prayer. It was as powerful as any king and as rich as any lord. The feudal era wasn't just the age of knights and lords. The church was one of the most important pillars of this system. They didn't just control people's souls, they controlled their land too. And so, in the name of God, crowns were placed on heads, wars were started, and even kings had to kneel. A king's son could only be considered legitimate if blessed by God's representative on earth. That representative was the Pope sitting in Rome. But the church's power wasn't only in Rome. Every town had a church, every region had a bishop, and every country had an archbishop. And the church wasn't just about faith, it was also a lord. Bishops, archbishops, and even the popes owned large tracts of land. Some of the most fertile land in Europe was under the church's control. People would make donations to the church to get their sins forgiven or to save their souls after death. Some gave gold, others silver, and some even gave land. Over time, the church became so powerful that it owned more land than many lords and even kings. Son, the church wasn't just a spiritual authority. It was a real political force. Popes could make kings rise to the throne or take them down. With inquisition courts, they could silence dissenting voices and excommunicate a ruler, making them a pariah in the eyes of their people. And sometimes, even kings had to kneel before the power of the church. Look, son, in the feudal age, rulers were always at war with each other, but a king's greatest fear wasn't a sword, it was excommunication. When a pope excommunicated a ruler, the ruler's people no longer had to obey him. For a society that believed in the church, this punishment was worse than losing a battle. That's why even the strongest kings had to bow to the popes. For example, when Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV clashed with Pope Gregory VII, the Pope excommunicated him. What happened? The emperor had to stand barefoot in the snow at the Pope's door for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. That's how powerful the church was. They could bring kings to their knees without lifting a sword. The church didn't just control rulers, son. It controlled the people too. A peasant's life in the Middle Ages was deeply intertwined with the church. When they were born, they were baptized. When they married, they were blessed. And when they died, they couldn't be buried without a priest's prayer. But the church wasn't just about religious rituals. In the feudal system, monasteries became powerful forces. These holy places weren't just places of worship. They were centers of knowledge and economy. Monasteries owned large amounts of land. Farmers worked the land, and they had to give part of their produce to the church. Plus, there were heavy taxes to pay. The church collected a tax called tithe, which meant that every peasant had to give 1/10 of their harvest to the church. And if a peasant didn't comply, they could be declared heretic, even have their properties seized. But the power of the monasteries wasn't just in their land, they were also the centers of education. The church was the only institution that taught reading and writing. That's why even kings needed priests to handle their correspondence. Monasteries were where manuscripts were stored, preserving knowledge. Without those books, we might have forgotten the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. The church was both the spiritual and material foundation of the feudal system, son. Landed power, the church owned large estates and ruled them like any lord. Tax and economic power, the people paid taxes to the church, making it wealthy enough to rival kings. Educational and knowledge monopoly, monasteries were the only centers for preserving and sharing knowledge. Political authority, popes were powerful enough to determine the fate of kings. Spiritual influence over the people, the church controlled people with promises of heaven and fear of sin. This system lasted for centuries. But remember, power is never eternal. No matter how powerful the church was, there would come a time when it would be shaken. Because people didn't live on prayers alone. Hunger, war, and injustice could make even the strongest faiths falter. So, son, the church was one of the strongest pillars of the feudal system. But like all great powers, its downfall was inevitable. Now, would you like me to tell you about the times when the church itself was shaken? Kid, there used to be great cities in Europe. Rome, Constantinople, Athens. These cities were centers of knowledge, art, and trade. People would walk the streets, and the markets were always packed. But you should know that every golden age comes to an end. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the cities began to decline. The cities were the places where trade and craftsmanship happened. But during the feudal age, trade started to decrease, and roads became dangerous. Bandits and warriors would cut off the merchants' paths. Caravans got smaller, markets emptied, and the cities, once shining and lively, gradually shrank and became smaller. Because people no longer felt safe in the cities. Shrinking cities led to the rise of the countryside. People starving in the cities sought refuge on the land of the lords, because feudal lords provided protection in their large estates. As trade decreased in the cities, agricultural economies started to take over. People had no choice but to work the land to survive instead of making craft. Kid, the feudal economy wasn't based on trade, it was based on land. Whoever owned the land had power. That's why even kings relied on the support of the lords. The lords were the ones who fed the people and financed the armies, but remember, the power of land depended on its cultivation. And that's why the peasants were bound to their masters. The fields were plowed, taxes were collected, and grain stores were filled. This way, the economic foundation of the feudal system was established. When trade declined in the cities, the economy became completely based on land. The feudal lords collected taxes from the peasants, and with that money they fed their soldiers. Agriculture became the biggest source of production during this time. But everything was in the hands of the lords. The peasants didn't own the land they worked on. They were born and lived as serfs. The feudal lords would give them a piece of land, but in return they took heavy taxes and worked them for free. Every harvest went to the lord's storage. But what if there was famine? Well, then the peasants had no choice but to starve. In such a world, it was hard for trade to grow. The farmers only produced enough to feed themselves. There was no market to sell extra goods. This was the biggest flaw in the feudal economy. Without trade, wealth was only tied to land. But people didn't live on bread alone. They needed knowledge, art, and innovation too. But the darkness of the feudal age trapped people on their farms. Kid, if land is the greatest power, then you had to build the strongest castles to protect it. The feudal age was also the age of castles. A powerful lord would have great stone castles built to protect himself and his people. But these castles weren't just piles of stones. They were symbols of power and control. The taller they were, the more majestic they seemed. The stronger they were, the more intimidating they became. Castles weren't just shelters for warriors. They were also refuges for the people. When enemies came, the lord's men would pull the peasants into the castle, and the huge gates would close. While the enemies screamed outside, the people inside would wait to survive. A lord, no matter how powerful, couldn't rule without a castle. That's why stone walls rose across Europe, high towers, moats, massive gates. All of these were like shields against attacks. Remember, kid, a castle isn't just a shelter, it's also a war machine. Feudal lords built their castles so that they stood like a rock against enemy armies. The strategic locations of castles were very important. They were built on hills, so as the attacking enemy climbed up, they would slow down, and archers could easily pick them off. They were built near water sources, because when a castle was under siege, water and food supplies were the most important things. They used concentric walls, so even if one wall was breached, the other walls would slow down the attackers. And the battles, the wars fought over castles, were always bloody. When an army besieged a castle, it could take months or even years to get inside, but if the people inside ran out of food, not even the strongest walls could protect them. That's why siege warfare was also a game of patience and strategy. Kid, during the feudal age, while the cities weakened, the rural economy grew stronger. Land became the greatest wealth, and the lords built massive castles to protect it. But remember, castles aren't forever. One day, even these stone walls will be overcome, and this feudal order will be shaken. Cities will rise again, and trade will flourish. But until that day comes, the feudal lords ruled from their castles, and the peasants fought for survival in their fields. Now, do you want me to tell you how these castles fell, son? What I'm about to tell you is about the sense of justice in these lands. The courts, laws, and lawyers you know today didn't exist back then. In that time, justice was in the hands of the powerful. The king's word, the lord's command, the sharpness of the sword. Whatever they said was the law. In that era, it was the privilege of the nobles to decide if someone was guilty or not. Feudal lords were both rulers and judges in their own lands. Everyone who lived on their land had to bow to their justice, and that justice was often bloody, cruel, and merciless. When a crime was committed, the court was held in a big stone hall, where the Lord sat on his throne. There was no book of law here. Everything was at the Lord's discretion. If the Lord believed the defendant was guilty, the punishment would be severe. The courts for the nobles were different from those of the peasants. Nobles at least had the right to a trial, but for the peasants, their fate was at the whim of the Lord. If a peasant went against the landowner, couldn't pay heavy taxes, or stole the Lord's game, their punishment was often ruthless. Sometimes they were whipped, sometimes thrown in prison, and at worst hanged. And remember, son, the greatest crime in feudal courts was challenging the Lord's authority. So, in a Lord's court, a peasant often couldn't prove their innocence. Son, back then, instead of courts, swords spoke. If there was a disagreement between two men, they didn't go to court. They solved it by spilling blood. It was called a blood feud. If a member of a family was killed, revenge had to be taken. And so, the hostility would continue for generations. But sometimes, whether a man was guilty or not was determined by a duel. If someone was accused of a crime, they'd be given a sword and asked to fight the accuser. Whoever won was considered in the right. It was believed that God protected the righteous. Let me tell you something even scarier. There was a trial called God's judgment. When a man was accused of a crime, he was subjected to brutal tests to see if God would save him or not. The accused would hold a hot iron rod and walk a certain distance. If the wounds didn't heal in a few days, they were considered guilty. Sometimes, a man would be tied up and thrown into water. If the water accepted him and he floated, he was guilty. But if he sank, he was considered innocent. Isn't that strange, son? To prove innocence, a person had to risk drowning. Now let me tell you about the world of the nobles. Son, back then, a powerful lord's greatest weapon wasn't just his sword. It was royal marriages. Because in the feudal age, power wasn't just won on the battlefield. Sometimes, the greatest victory was gained through a marriage. A lord could gain land by waging war against another lord, or by strategically marrying his daughter into a powerful family. That's why noble women were often just pawns. A young lady would be married off to a man she didn't even know, all for her father's interests. If she was lucky, her husband would respect her. But most of the time, these marriages were just political tools. The ladies had no say in their own destinies. Women, son, being a woman in the feudal world was hard. If a woman was born into a noble family, she would become the wife of a lord. But if she was widowed, things would change. Some widowed countesses would manage the land left by their husbands and could even command armies. But most of the time, they were pressured by male relatives to remarry because the feudal system didn't want women to be independent. If a woman wanted to live freely, she had one other choice: to seek refuge in a convent. Nuns withdrew from worldly affairs and lived a life dedicated to God. But convents weren't just places of worship. They were also centers of knowledge. Ancient manuscripts were preserved there, and young girls were educated. But remember, once a woman entered a convent, she was cut off from the world. In the feudal age, justice was often a game for the powerful. The courts were in the hands of the lords. Crime and punishment were determined by blood and sword. Women were often overshadowed by power struggles. But remember, son, no system is eternal. One day this feudal justice system will crumble, and a time will come when the rule of law will prevail. But until that day comes, the lords will rule, blood will be shed, and power will always be in the hands of the victor. Let me know if you need further adjustments. Son, what I'm about to tell you is about the concept of justice in these lands. The courts, laws, and lawyers you know today didn't exist back then. In those times, justice was in the hands of the powerful. The king's word, the Lord's command, the sharpness of the sword. Whatever they said, that was the law. In that era, deciding whether someone was guilty or not was the privilege of the nobles. Feudal lords were both rulers and judges in their own territories. Everyone living on their land had to bow to their justice, and most of the time that justice was bloody, cruel, and merciless. When a crime was committed, the court was held in a large stone hall, a gathering where the Lord sat on his throne. There was no book of laws here. Everything was up to the Lord's judgment. If the Lord believed the accused was guilty, the punishment was severe. The nobles' courts were different from the peasants' courts. Nobles at least had the right to a trial, but for the peasants, their fate was up to the Lord's whims. If a peasant opposed the landowner, couldn't pay heavy taxes, or stole the Lord's game, the punishment was often brutal. Sometimes they'd be whipped, sometimes thrown in prison, and in the worst case, hung from the gallows. And don't forget, son, in feudal courts, the biggest crime was challenging the Lord's authority. That's why, in a Lord's court, a peasant rarely proved their innocence. Son, back in those days, swords spoke louder than courts. If two men had a dispute, they wouldn't go to court, they'd settle it with blood. They called it a blood feud. If someone from a family was killed, revenge was expected. And so, the hostility would continue for generations. But sometimes, a man's guilt was decided by a duel. If someone was accused, they'd be given a sword and told to fight the accuser. Whoever won was considered right, because it was believed that God would protect the righteous. Let me tell you something even darker. There was a trial called the judgment of God. When a man was accused of a crime, he would go through brutal tests to see if God would save him. The accused would hold a hot iron rod and walk a certain distance. If his wounds didn't heal within days, he was guilty. Sometimes a man would be tied up and thrown into water. If the water accepted him and he floated, he was guilty. But if he sank, he was innocent. Strange, isn't it, son? To prove your innocence, you had to drown. Now, I'll tell you about the world of the nobles. Son, in those days, the greatest weapon a powerful lord had wasn't just his sword, but his dynastic marriages. Because in the feudal age, power wasn't just won on the battlefield. Sometimes the greatest victory came through marriage. A lord could gain land by waging war with another lord, or he could marry his daughter to a powerful family to gain an ally. That's why noble women were often pawns in political games. A young lady would be married off, not for love, but for her father's interests. If she was lucky, her husband might respect her. But most of the time, these marriages were just political tools. Noble women didn't have the right to choose their fate. Women? Ah, son, being a woman in the feudal world was tough. If a woman was born into a noble family, she would be the wife of a lord. But if she became a widow, things changed. Some widowed countesses managed the land left by their husbands, even commanded armies. But most of the time they were pressured by male relatives and forced to remarry, because the feudal system didn't want women to be independent. If a woman wanted a free life, she had one other option, the monastery. Nuns withdrew from the world and lived a life dedicated to God. But monasteries weren't just places of worship, they were centers of knowledge. Old manuscripts were preserved there, and young girls were educated. But remember, once a woman entered a monastery, she was cut off from the world. In the feudal age, justice was often a game for the powerful. Courts were in the hands of the lords. Crimes and punishments were determined with blood and swords. Women often remained in the shadows of power struggles. But remember, son, no system lasts forever. One day, this feudal system of justice will crumble, and times will come when the rule of law will prevail. But until that day, the lords will rule, blood will spill, and power will always be in the hands of the strongest. Son, history, this massive river, sometimes changes its course with the strokes of a sword. And 1066 was one of those turning points. That year, the Normans, backed by the harsh winds of the north, landed on English soil and forever changed the flow of history. The Normans were sea warriors. They were descendants of the Vikings. They had first settled in the north of France, where they built a powerful duchy. But their eyes were always set on a bigger prize, England. And so, a man named William was about to turn that dream into reality. At that time, England was ruled by King Harold, but William, the Duke of Normandy, claimed that he was the true heir to the English throne. And so, the inevitable happened. The Norman armies crossed the sea and landed in England. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the two armies faced off. Harold's Anglo-Saxon soldiers were strong, but the Norman army was more disciplined. William's cavalry and archers tore apart the English lines. By the end of the battle, Harold was dead, and William took the throne, earning the title the Conqueror. But a king didn't just get crowned. He had to solidify his power, and William did that by bringing feudalism to England. The Normans hadn't just conquered a kingdom, they had also brought feudalism to these shores. When William took the throne, he got rid of most of the old Anglo-Saxon nobles. In their place, he put loyal Norman lords. But William didn't just give them land to ensure their loyalty. He also put them into a strict system. Norman feudalism was different from others. William declared that every inch of England belonged to him. Then he distributed this land as fiefs to his loyal lords. But these lords weren't just landowners. They were also bound to the king with absolute loyalty. In this new system, every lord was a direct vassal of the king. In other parts of feudal Europe, lords could often challenge their kings. But in England, William created such a tight system that no one dared defy him. That's why the Normans didn't just conquer England. They brought the strictest, most powerful version of feudalism to this land. And son, William didn't just rule with a sword. He also built an empire with his intelligence. In 1086, he created a huge record book known as the Doomsday Book. This book recorded every village, every field, every animal, and every lord in England. This way, William knew exactly how much land each lord had, who they collected taxes from, and which peasants worked for whom. This book made sure that feudalism ran as strictly as possible. And so, in England, feudalism became even stronger than it was in France. Because here, the kings didn't depend on the lords depended on the kings. Son, history teaches us big lessons, and the story of the Normans shows us that power isn't just won with a sword, but also with the mind. William wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder of order. He conquered England, but his real victory was in establishing feudalism on solid foundations. And that's why you can still see his mark today. In the cities, the castles, the laws. History, even if we're not aware of it, keeps living with us. Now close your eyes and imagine the iron armor of the Norman knights, their battle cries, the sound of their horses' hooves. History is a story whispered into your ears, son. And if you listen carefully, it will tell you many things.